Tim Baker, back to back. Good to have you on the show.
Good to be back, Tim. What's good?
This episode is one I've been looking forward to because over the past 7+ years of the podcast, we've talked at length about the accumulation side of the equation, right? When it comes to saving
Yeah.
for retirement, we've talked about things like how do you determine how much is enough and what are some strategies for investing when it comes to traditional retirement accounts. Think 401k, 403b, IRAs. We've talked about options for investing when you've already maxed out these accounts. And we're going to link to those episodes in the show notes for folks that want to learn more about the accumulation stage. But this episode is really about the other side of the equation, which is one that I don't think we give enough attention to, which is the withdrawal strategy. Hey, we finally get to this point in the future of retirement and whatever that may look like. And we've got to be able to produce an income for ourselves in retirement that otherwise was provided to us by our employer throughout our career. And as obvious as that sounds, I think it's something we don't think enough about. And I love how you frame this as a concept of building a retirement paycheck. So paint a picture for us of what you mean by that.
Yeah. And I think even before I get into that, Tim, I don't think that we're alone in kind of our ignoring the, kind of the withdrawal phase. One of the things in the CFP curriculum, certified financial planning curriculum, is they don't really talk about this too much. And I think there's a gap. It's all about, hey, amass wealth as much as you can. And, we'll get these buckets of money. And then when we retire, then what? Right. And I even remember the first firm that I ever worked with, it was almost like our clients were driving those decisions, which is not a bad thing, but we would basically say, like, how much do you need this year? And then we would, basically send that to them, distribute those assets in the most efficient way possible. But it wasn't really us doing analysis of like, okay, what do we need to, what can we spend? Or, how do we make this nest egg last us for time unknown, right? So to me, there's a gap there. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. So when I think about this, like building a retirement paycheck, I really think of this as like a multifaceted thing. There's so many things, just think about it from the accumulation side,
Right.
all the different things that go on. Like, obviously we get a paycheck, but we also have benefits from our employer, like health insurance. We're saving for retirement, which is not something we typically do in retirement, but it's the paycheck itself. And how do we access these buckets of money and spend them down in an a tax efficient way possible, but also like efficient in terms of like your life. I finally started reading the book, Die with Zero, Tim. So I'm in the beginning parts of
So
that.
good.
And it's such a different thought process of like, hey, you get dividends, to go on a tangent here. You get dividends from life experiences. So like if one of the things I did after I got in the Army is I backpacked Europe for 4 months, right? Just kind of went to the wind and like, this is awesome, kind of a YOLO experience. And what he says in those types of things is like, those dividends have paid you back in terms of memories over decades of your life. If you wait to do that when you're in your 60s or 70s, and then you pass away at 90, you have a couple decades, but not a lifetime.
Yep.
So it's also spending down the portfolio in a way that maximizes those types of things. So, it's housing decisions, it's long-term care planning, all of those, it's estate planning. All of these things are really important as we transition from accumulation to decumulation, but just in a different way. Everything's still happening very similarly. It's just, instead of the employer giving you a check, you have to kind of figure that out yourself.
I'm so glad you mentioned Die with Zero. We should probably do a whole separate episode on that. I often tell people, like, if you read Die with Zero, don't only read Die with Zero, because you're gonna like drain all your bank accounts, right? But it's such a different concept. It's so refreshing. And to your point, like there's that dividend component, but it's also a learned behavior. We start to talk about the tactical side of withdrawals. We have to remember there's a big emotional piece here. So we can talk about, what's the best tax efficient way? And is it this strategy? Is it that strategy? And actually getting money out of your account. But that is a mental shift when for decades you've been putting money in, seeing those accounts grow outside of some of the volatility of the market. And all of a sudden we're making a conscious choice to take money out and see those accounts go down. that's a piece that gets left out so often as well.
And I don't know why, Tim, but for whatever reason, I feel like on my YouTube feed, I'm getting a lot of like videos about like the FIRE movement and people abandoning the FIRE movement. And part of the struggle with the FIRE movement, again, no hate on the FIRE movement, but is exactly what you're talking about, but like to extremes where, I'm saving and saving and saving, and then I get to my freedom number or whatever, and then I'm like expected to
Shift.
behave,
Yeah.
the shift the behavior and spend down, and it's like, oh, I don't want to. So just like everything in life, it's about balance, right? And you can't, we kind of talk about, you can't, do this your whole life. So, listeners can't see this, but I have an open hand where where you spend, and you can't do this necessarily your whole life where it's a closed hand and you save,
Yeah.
because what's the point, right? So to me, it's really about finding the balance. And this again goes back to the idea, not necessarily of a plan, but planning with the G on the end. Planning, Corey Jenks out there. So to me, that's what this is all about. And again, it is a shift, because for 30, 40, maybe 50 years, if you're an overachiever and you've saved, very, very early in your career, you've been, socking money away for future you. And now future you is here. And it's like, okay, what do we do?
Tim, I remember it's probably maybe 2-3 years ago, we did a retirement series, and part of that, and again, we'll link some of those episodes in the show notes, but part of the motivation for that was you going through the RICP training. And, we talk about the alphabet soup of credentials behind pharmacists. I think you're starting to compete with some pharmacists out there, right? With the CFP, the RICP, and the life planning. But I remember you going through that certification, and despite the experience that you had, obviously the CFP credential, which we feel like has a ton of weight and value and how comprehensive it is in both the education and the experience, it really felt like the RICP for you unlocked some other resources, information that perhaps weren't covered in the same level of detail with the CFP. Tell us about that.
Yeah, and to go to the CFP, like there is a retirement section in the CFP, but a lot of that I think is geared more towards like retirement plans. Like what's an IRA, what's a Roth IRA, what's a simple, when do you use a defined benefit, for like self-employed people, a defined benefit or defined contribution plan. So it's very plan driven. So almost like product driven versus like, what do we do when we get to the end here? And it's like, and for me, it was like, I want to be able to answer that question of, hey, I'm 65, I want to retire next year. Like, what does that look like? So the RICP really focuses on the transition from the accumulation to the decumulation phase in retirement. And, it's really trying to figure how to turn your savings into a retirement income stream for time unknown, right? And the things that's covered is obviously like rebuilding the retirement paycheck, retirement income planning, but it's Social Security and Medicare, it's tax efficient withdrawal strategies, annuities and guaranteed income, long-term care planning, estate and legacy planning, and housing decisions, which is going to be one of the biggest expenses for retirees. Especially early on. So to me, it's really, really important it was really important for me to do a deep dive in those things, because again, I think the CFP, which is great, and you can't do a deep dive in everything. It's almost like, PGY1 is what, like a general residency to like a PGY2, where you're more specialization. I think this is more the PGY2. So my belief is that if you're working with a financial planner, they darn well sure better be a CFP. But I think if you're in that retirement, close to retirement or in retirement, I would say RICP is something that they absolutely need to do. And some of the strategies that we'll talk about really cover a lot of the things that I listed that, the RICP goes through.
Yeah, and retirement income certified professional. So that's what the RICP stands for folks that are curious about that. And it's a timely discussion, Tim, because last week on episode 404, when we were talking about questions to consider when you're evaluating hiring a financial planner, one of those big questions was, what's included in the plan and the planning process, and is there alignment with your planning needs and the experiences and credentials and education of the people that are leading those services. So before we jump into the 3 strategies, 2 important disclaimers. All right. First and foremost, when we talk about withdrawal strategies and approaches, of course, there's some foundational work that has to be done that will be critical to knowing which of these approaches may make the most sense, right? So obviously, how much do we have saved? What buckets are those funds in? What are the retirement goals? What are the potential risks? How might Social Security fit in? So lots of work to be done before implementing a withdrawal strategy. The second thing that of course has to be said is everyone's situation is different. Of course, there's more than three strategies, and this is not intended to be advice. We really feel like the work that we do, our team does one-on-one when we're doing financial planning with clients, that's where the application and the implementation of these strategies would come. Again, curious to learn more about their services, go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com, book a discovery call. We'd love to have a conversation. So Tim, let's jump into these three strategies. And with each one, you'll provide a high-level overview of exactly what is the strategy, and then some of the advantages, disadvantages, considerations, and who it may be best for. So let's start with the flooring strategy, which is our first of the three strategies. Tell us about what the flooring strategy is.
Yeah, so the flooring strategy is probably the most conservative, and it's probably the most neglected is probably not the use, but I would say one it's probably more on the shelf collecting dust for a lot of people. And we'll go through why that is, but it's a conservative approach that involves creating a layer of guaranteed income, which we call the floor, to cover the essential expenses. So we're talking about housing, food, utilities, healthcare, the things that are going to go out the door regardless of anything, right?
Yep.
And usually what we use to build the floor are things that provide guarantee, hopefully lifetime income. So that's typically Social Security, a pension if you still have those from your employer, or an annuity that you purchase on the market. So this is the best solution to mitigate the risk of running out of money. So you essentially, and it's essentially using like, obviously Social Security and a pension, is a benefit, that you basically bought into during your career, and it's provided by the US government and or a company. An annuity is typically where you're working with an insurance company to say, hey, here's a chunk of money. I want this over my life, over the extent of my lifetime. They don't know how long you're going to live, but they use, tables to kind of figure that out. How much do I get for this chunk of money? So the discretionary expenses are then, so once we figure out, okay, these are the essentials for me to live, then anything above that, the discretionary expenses typically are funded from your remaining investments. So it'd be, okay, I still have some money in my 401k or my Roth IRA or a brokerage account. So, converting these assets to an income stream, i.e. like an annuity, eliminates the possibility of like you withdrawing too much, right? So one might be saying, hey, this sounds great. So let's talk about advantages, but we'll also talk about disadvantages. So the advantages here is that if you can create this floor, it guarantees basic living expenses for life. So if you think about that, like that, to me, when I hear that, is super like peace of mind, right?
Warm blanket.
Yeah, it's the warm blanket, right? It reduces the anxiety about market volatility. So right now, like if you had a floor in place and you know that a check was coming from an annuity, a pension, and a Social Security to pay the mortgage if you still have it, or buy food, like you are inoculated from the craziness that is the market, right? And that's the psychological thing, I think, is the biggest advantage.
Yeah.
Because I always make this joke, I think sometimes my dad thinks I like day trade. He's like, oh, what about the market? Every time I see him, and I'm like, I don't know. I haven't even looked at it, and I think he's kind of preoccupied by that, right? And if you are retired, you want to live, right? You don't want to have to worry about the market and like where the next paycheck, figuratively speaking, is coming from.
Yeah, there can become an obsession with tracking the market. Yeah, for sure.
Yes. Yeah. I think the other thing is that it simplifies cash flow management. And it actually also reduces the risk for like elder care abuse. So sometimes, if you've ever, it's like, hey, Mrs. Jones, why are you redoing your kitchen? Or, why are you having solar panels put on your house? Sometimes older people can be at risk for people to defraud them or to sell them things that you don't need. So if there's less money available and your money's coming from a check, it's just less to take, so to speak. So one of the things that we train on as financial planners is to kind of be aware of some of these things. So if I have $1 million versus I have 200,000 because I put a large chunk into an annuity, that's harder for someone to get to. And then, it's the custom flexibility. You can pair this with, typically you still pair this with a bucket strategy or systemic withdrawal strategy, which we'll talk about. So those are the big advantages. And for a lot of people, that peace of mind and not having to worry about the market is why they do this. From a disadvantage perspective, Tim, it can severely reduce your liquidity. So once you purchase that annuity, you've taken a chunk out of your IRA or your 401k and given that to an insurance company. Now, what they give back to you is a steady stream of checks for the rest of your life. But in the event of an emergency or things like that money is not accessible.
So a quick, for instance, Tim, I might have, say, $1 million, round numbers, $1 million in my IRA, and depending on, and we've talked about annuities on the show, so people can check that out, and lots of different things to think about there. But I might take or peel off, say, $300,000 of that IRA, or 400 or 200, whatever the number is, and convert that to a guaranteed monthly paycheck, essentially, and we would know what that dollar amount is, and then you're kind of looking at what's the opportunity cost there, is what you're referring to. That, hey, if I don't have these dollars now kind of investing and growing, because we're not just going to stop investing our money when we get to retirement, we're still going to have some of those dollars that hopefully are in a growth phase as well. But we're taking those dollars off the table and saying, hey, instead, we want to have this guaranteed income stream.
Yeah, so it's really twofold. It's the opportunity cost and potentially lower returns. So, what else, how else could that money have grown outside of it just kind of coming to me in the form of a check? But it's also like, hey, we have a flood or something goes out on the house and I don't have enough liquid set aside to account for that. So now I'm dipping into maybe some of my more riskier or volatile investments to cover that. So it's both the opportunity cost and then, kind of the risk that you need liquidity to. Now, again, I would make sure that we have an emergency, the emergency fund never goes away, but sometimes, that, an emergency can kind of outpace, what you have liquid. The other is inflation risk. So I would say, I don't know if it's all, but I would say most annuities that you're going to purchase don't include a COLA, cost of living adjustment. So if inflation outpaces the growth of the guaranteed income, purchasing power may erode. And this is why Social Security is so powerful. And one of the biggest decisions that you make is because every year it kind of keeps pace with inflation. Retirees would argue maybe not as much as it should, but the one of the biggest expense or riders that you could have in an annuity purchase is like some type of adjustment that the rate goes up, and it's typically not pegged to COLA. It's typically like, hey, I want a 1% or a 2% kind of arbitrary adjustment every year, and that's expensive. So that's a big thing, is inflation risk. The other big thing is loss of control. It can feel restrictive. It's like, hey, I was looking at $1 million, now I'm looking at $500,000 or whatever the case is. Complexity and cost. So there's lots of different flavors of annuities. I kind of believe if you buy an annuity, keep it simple. So there are ones that are more, but you're going to have complexity. You're going to have costs associated with that, just like you have in investments. And probably the last thing is just kind of dependence on the insurance company and their solvency. So, and Social Security backed by the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. So you can argue how stable that is, but the insurance company, they're typically a for-profit. They're not the federal government. And while most, insurance companies have, state guarantee associations and protections, there's limits there. So those are the big disadvantages.
So Tim, if we just zoom out for a moment, I'm oversimplifying to kind of make the point here with the flooring strategy. And I thought you said something real important, is to not think about these as necessarily three discrete strategies. Often we may have more than one approach, right? So as we talk about these three individually, but let's say I evaluate my monthly expenses and, I determine, hey, it's going to be $10,000 for Jess and I in retirement. And of that, let's say $5,000 are essential expenses, the ones you talked about, housing, utilities, food, healthcare, et cetera. And the other five is discretionary things that we want to be able to do, grandkids, travel, whatever, right? Eating out, those kinds of things. So with the flooring strategy, the idea would be either between Social Security, a pension, which maybe some of our listeners might have, but many not, and or an annuity. I would try to replace that 5,000. And then, as you mentioned, through other assets, we would account for the other 5,000.
Yeah. So to kind of take that example, let's say the floor that we have to set is $5,000. So those are for
Mm-hmm.
the essential expenses: housing, food, gas, utilities, medical stuff, insurance, all that stuff. So let's say it's five. Let's say Social Security covers three of that. Then we have a gap in the floor of $2,000. Now, I ran this example a while ago, so I don't know if this holds true, but let's say you're a 65-year-old male in Ohio and you purchase a SPIA, which is a single premium income annuity. So basically that money gets sent to that chunk of money gets sent to the insurance company.
Mm-hmm.
And then within a year, you can direct how this is, but at least within the years, you start getting a check back. So if we were to say, hey, we need $2,000, now this would just be for, if we use you as an example, this would just be for your life. We would probably want to set this up for, basically second to die. So if you were to pass away, Jess would still get this.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But for the purposes of this, let's just say we want $2,000 a month for the rest of your life. That would cost you about $310,000.
Mm-hmm.
So that means that we, out of your traditional or Roth or whatever your 401k, we would peel those dollars off. Basically give that to the insurance company. 3,000 would come from per month would come from your, Social Security. So you get a check for that. And then the insurance
Mm-hmm.
company would send you a $2,000 check for the rest of your life. And then the other 5,000 per month, or $60,000 a year, would come from what's left of
Mm-hmm.
your traditional portfolio, or, if you had other,
Mm-hmm.
real estate or things like that. So in that case, those discretionary expenses, you might use some version of the bucket strategy and or the
Mm-hmm.
systemic withdrawal strategy.
I'm tracking. And since we've talked about annuities now a few times, this was episode 305. We talked about understanding annuities, a primer for pharmacists. Check that out. Lots of good information in that show. So Tim, as we put a bow on the flooring strategy, we started with the most conservative approach. You mentioned that. You talked through the concept of essentially being able to create a floor of those fixed expenses. You mentioned the advantages, disadvantages, and clearly it feels like this would be best for those individuals that are on the more risk averse side of things, and there's a prioritization of security potentially over growth.
Security over growth. Yeah. So
Yeah.
if you're somebody that's like, give me all the insurances, this might be more in your camp. If you're like, I want to self-insure, or I don't
Mm-hmm.
want that much life insurance, or, I'm kind of using, an analogy here, but like, this might not be best for you because
Yeah.
you want more, you're more, risk tolerant. So this is someone that doesn't necessarily want to worry about the market, and just wants that steady check coming in,
Mm-hmm.
for the rest of their life. And, yeah.
Great stuff. And I think, I'm projecting a little bit, but I could see that a lot of pharmacists may like that concept, or at least a portion of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say I have a pretty big appetite for risk, but part of me is like, man, if I give up 310 and I get 2,000 for the rest of my life, just clockwork, and I know that combined with my Social Security is going to pay the essentials, I'm not mad at that. I know there's some
Mhm.
people that are like, well, what happens if like I give 310 and then I die the next day? There are certain things where you can get like return of premium, or
Right.
different riders. Now all
Cost
these
more.
riders cost money. So,
Hmm.
if you add every rider, that 2,000 might be 1,200. So, but there's more protection there, but that's the kind of the push and pull of this. So, yeah, I mean, I can see that. And I'm trying to like project my older self here, cause right now I'm just like run and gun, and, I'm more like risk, hey, all the risk and things like that. I have more appetite
Hmm.
for it. But again, and our job is not to project our own risk tolerance on clients, right? We need to, build
That's
a
right.
plan that's best suited for
Yeah.
them. But part of me can kind of see the appeal of this. Now, while I, push that button to move hundreds of $1,000s of over for that. I don't know. I don't know if I would
Yeah.
do that.
I'm glad you said projecting your older self though, right? Because this is important that I know my tendency, and I suspect maybe for others, is we tend to think that our current risk tolerance, risk capacity is what we're going to do also in the future. And that may not, or in some cases should not always be the case, right? I'm thinking about, as we're working on our own individual financial plans and we're taking a more aggressive investing approach. And perhaps there's, as we think about our plans, there's some investment in real estate, there's building to the business. If those things continue to grow and there's fruit from the risks that we took, at some point, you want to really lock in, to some degree, lock in the gains that have had. And there's a different level of risk that I probably will be thinking about at 60, 65 than we are at this phase of life and early 40s.
Yeah, and I kind of think about it like, I used to be able to like take a road trip and drive for 12 hours and like not blink. And now I'm like, nah, I'm good. Or even like playing basketball with Liam, like I'm not dunking on his head or anything like that. I'm like, I'll shoot the J. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I don't want to get hurt or do something dumb. Which I sound so old right now, but like I'm just projecting that out, when I'm in my 50s, 60s, 70s, and
Yeah, totally.
there might become a time where I'm just like, man, like let's keep it simple. Give me
Hmm.
my check, and I can like just chill and not have to worry about the market or things. I don't have to worry
Hmm.
about the hustle, But I could also see on the other side of that, like we talk about identity and role, like so much of some people get in trouble during retirement because so much of their identity is wrapped up in the role that they play and
Hmm.
professionally, whether that's a pharmacist, a financial planner. So maybe part of that is still being plugged into the
Hmm.
markets or the economy or things like that. But I think that's a razor's edge, right? Because you can become obsessive about it. Um, but obviously I work in this that I might get to the point where I'm like, I just want to like flip burgers and like not have to worry about that stuff.
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Good stuff. Let's shift to the second withdrawal strategy, which is the bucket strategy. Tell us more about this one.
Yeah. So the bucket strategy is essentially where you divide up your assets into buckets. So your funds are segmented into time-based buckets, each with its own investment profile. So if you look at bucket one, this might be for your next 0 to 5 years worth of
Hmm.
expenses. So this is the lowest risk. It's basically cash and cash like investments. So might be cash, I bonds, bonds in general, money market, things like that, right? So
Hmm.
if the market does what it's doing now, it's not going to affect what's going on. The second bucket two is typically, maybe 6 to 15 years out. So this is more moderate risk. You have more of a balanced asset allocation. So maybe like a 60-40, 50-50 equity to fixed income,
Hmm.
maybe some dividend paying stocks where the portfolio is producing some income. So more volatility, a little bit more return though, but not those huge swings that you're going to
Right.
see, which they'll typically get in bucket three, which is typically 15 plus years out. So this is where you put your higher risk, equities, stocks, that type of thing. So for a lot of people, from an understanding, the big advantages here is that it helps retirees mentally separate
Yes.
funds. So you're kind of matching investments to the time horizon. And this is I look at this as like purpose-based investing. So we talk about
Hmm.
purpose-based savings, like, hey, what's that money for? Like tie a purpose to it. Same with investing. It's a little bit easier with investing because most of the time it's in a 401k or an IRA. We know that purpose is for retirement. But like if we have a brokerage account that has $50,000 in it, I'm like, Tim, what's that money for? And a
Right.
lot of people are like, well, I don't know. Sometimes, and that could be for early retirement. It could be for the down payment on a property in the
Hmm.
future. So it allows people to kind of it enhances their understanding, and increases their peace of mind. So as an example, um, like if the market goes down like it's been going down lately and I have 3 years of expenses of cash for expenses, like in my mind, what the market is typically done is that it bounces back right
Hmm.
in 2, 3, 4 years. So I'm inoculated to that, right? So I'm not necessarily worried about it. Another advantage of this, it kind of encourages disciplined withdrawals. And one of the disadvantages is kind of how you refill the buckets, which I'll talk about here in a second. But there's a system for which you follow the withdrawal phase. It reduces the need to sell volatile investments or volatile assets during market downturns, which mitigates sequence of return risks, which we've talked about in previous episodes. Some say it supports higher equity allocation. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but potentially that 15-year bucket should be pretty, risk heavy for larger returns, and it can kind of provide a built-in rebalance the system. The disadvantage I would say to this is that it's complex. It can be complex to manage. So the rules for refilling your buckets can get confusing, and there's the delayed approach, which basically nothing happens until the first bucket, that liquid bucket, is completely depleted. The problem with that, Tim, is like, if that is now, like, you have market risks and sequence of return risks. Like, the timing of that can be tough. Another approach to refilling the buckets is the automatic approach. So you refill the buckets each year, regardless of what's happened in the market. So again, it's pretty rigid. So you're just like, this is what I do, right? Even if I'm going off a cliff. The other approach is the market-based approach, which the bucket is refilled based on what the market does. So you have a set of rules that says, if this happens, I do this. If that happens, I do that. Yep. And then the last one that you typically follow or could follow is the capital needs approach, which you need to determine kind of what your critical path or how much wealth should remain in each year of retirement to meet lifetime financial goals based on the portfolio return. So it's kind of like a plan backwards approach. So some of this, you could be in a trough right now, which is kind of where we're at, and you're like, what do I do? Like, this doesn't seem like I should be selling, some of my equities or even moderate base. I'm selling low. So that can be tough. The another disadvantage I would say is the potential cash drag. So if you amass 1 to 5 years of cash, that could be harmful during inflationary periods, because that money, inflation is eating away at that, and it can reduce the overall portfolio efficiency. Others argue that the time segmentation is straight up arbitrary.
Right.
So if there's a poor market or spending increase, the buckets may not hold up. There's no guaranteed income in this. So you have Social Security, obviously, but you don't have a floor. So your Social Security might cover a portion of your essential expenses, but it's not going to cover everything. So that's a problem. And then I would say the sequence of return risk still exists, and it can be challenging to rebalance just in volatile markets. So it's, you could be doing things that you shouldn't be doing, but it's like, hey, I got to fill the buckets. I got to make sure that the money cascades throughout the bucket system.
Tim, as you were talking about this, I sense that my feelings, and I suspect maybe others listening are, is you describe the 3 buckets. It's like, okay, I get it. That all makes sense. And then you start to think about some of the management of it and the different ways that you could do it. And it could be, as you mentioned, more administratively complex, especially if somebody's trying to DIY it, or even if they're working with an advisor, there need to be some communication. Are we establishing rules? What exactly are we doing? How are we doing it? And for some, there may be a comfort level of that may not be for others, which is why this lives in the middle, not as conservative as the first, not as more dynamic as we'll talk about with the third. But the example you gave is a good one. When you said, hey, I'm in a trough, like we're now, what should I do? What came up for me there is when you said that, is how important it is to think through those things in advance of actually being in the trough and asking the question, what should I do? Right. So actually stress testing some of this of, hey, when the down market comes, not if, but when the down market comes, what are we going to do? How are we going to react to that? Are we going to hold true to these real? And this is both numbers and feelings. But I think a lot of the literature and our experience would tell us that it's not in the moments of the market kind of falling out and the situations we're having now where we want to really put the test. What are we actually going to be doing? But can we work through that in advance, or at least do the best that we can? Of course, reality, may present itself to be a little bit different. All right, let's move on to the third strategy, which is the systemic withdrawal strategy. Tell us more about this one, Tim.
Yeah, so I would say this is probably the most popular strategy for, at least for financial planners. I think probably even for people that do it themselves. I would say the bucket strategy is probably the second most popular. This was kind of made um, popular, I guess, or known by the 4% rule.
Mm-hmm.
So it's often associated with the 4% rule. And this method really involves withdrawing a fixed percentage from the portfolio annually, potentially adjusting for inflation and market performance. So the 4% rule kind of came from a study. It was based on a 30-year time period. So kind of a rolling 30-year periods in the market's history to determine, in the worst 30-year, rolling period, what was the safe withdrawal rate for an investor to withdraw so the money wouldn't run out at the, basically at the end. So from someone who was age 65 to say 95.
Mm-hmm.
So in the study, the worst 30 years, and I think the study goes back to 1926, Tim, but in the study, basically the worst 30-year period was 1966 to 1995, which I guess at the end of that, I don't know if that was like the dot-com bubble,
Close, right?
95.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the worst rolling 30-year period. And what the study said was that the safe maximum withdrawal rate of that portfolio, the worst one was 4.15%. And this, they used
Adjusted for
interesting,
inflation, right?
correct.
Yeah.
And they use the 50/50 kind of stocks to bonds allocation, which I think most people would agree now that that's not necessarily a great allocation over the course of a retirement. So the people saw that number, they're like, great, 4%. So if I have $1 million, I can withdraw 40 grand for the rest of my life, typically 30 years, and I'm not going to run out of money. Um, the problem with that is typically, so the problem with the 4% rule is it's rigid. The allocation with 50/50 between stocks and bonds, I don't think is great. Um, the it's very much focused on U.S. stocks, and a lot of people
Mm-hmm.
don't think that U.S. stocks will perform as well as they did, in the future as they did in the past. Um, the longevity is a problem because you know the study says that retirement will last 30 years, and I think there's going to be a lot of people that follow this are going to live a lot longer
Longer. Mm-hmm.
because life expectancies have risen, and it didn't really um, the inflation averaged a modest 2% in the study. So we saw it in 2022 was 8.3, and that can throw a major wrench.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other thing that's problematic is that spending is not linear. Often we talk about spending in retirement as like a smile. So in your early retirement, you're like, okay, YOLO, I don't have to punch the clock anymore. I'm traveling, I'm doing all the things. And then spending typically dips as you're kind of more, hey, I don't want to travel as much. I want to be home. And then it typically goes up when, medical expenses start to rise. So spending is not linear, so you should adjust. Like what a lot of people that would say against the 4% rule is like, you should probably be spending a lot more in the beginning, because spending is going to come down, and then make sure we have enough, and be
Yeah.
more aggressive outside of a 50/50 allocation for later life. So spending fluctuates. It's not a straight line, and doesn't
Mm-hmm.
account for taxes, doesn't account for fees and things like that, which can also be a major part of this. So proponents of the systemic withdrawal strategy would say, hey, the 4%, that's cute, that's a good place to start, but it actually needs to be more nuanced than that.
Mm-hmm.
So Guy and Klinger, two gentlemen, basically did a study that established kind of more responsive withdrawal rules. So the one withdrawal rule they basically said is like, hey, we'll start with 4 or 5%, wherever it is, and then each subsequent year the withdrawal amount is increased by the prior year inflation rate, unless the
Mm.
prior year investment return was negative, and the new year's withdrawal rate would be above the initial withdrawal rate.
Interesting.
So
Yeah.
that's a lot to kind of unpack, but the idea is that in this withdrawal rule, you are kind of flexible to what's going on in the market, not
Yeah.
just not just market returns, but also inflation. And probably one of the cardinal beliefs in retirement, and this can sometimes be hard to swallow, is be flexible. The more flexible that you can be with when you retire, how much you spend in retirement, all that, all that stuff, the more success, the odds increase of a successful retirement. And I define a successful retirement, at least at a baseline state, if you don't run out of money. Obviously we want to thrive, not survive, but that to me is like, you don't run out of money. So flexibility here is key. The other one that they looked at was the capital preservation rule. So you kind of start at 4%. And then if the current year withdrawal amount is more than 20% above the initial withdrawal rate, you reduce the withdrawal rate by 10%. So this reduces spending when the market returns are poor. And typically once you get to a certain age, i.e. 80 or 85, like the rule no longer applies, because they're assuming that there's a shorter window of time that you're fine. And then the last one that they talk about is kind of the prosperity rule. So if the current year withdrawal amount is less than 80% of the initial withdrawal rate, so basically what happens then is that we increase the withdrawal rate calculated by about like 10%. So this allows an increase in spending when the markets have done well. So you might listen to this and be like, Tim, what are you talking about? But what we're doing, and it's similar to the bucket rule, but what we're doing is essentially we're not on a conveyor belt with the 4% rule, which is kind of like, okay, $1 million, 40 grand, adjusted for inflation, great. But if the market is, if the market tanks for 3-4 years in a row, that could break, right? What we're doing is that we're looking at,
or you start working part-time, or like all
exactly.
the things, right?
So we're looking at the market returns, or we're looking at inflation, and we're making tweaks and adjusting your paycheck accordingly, right? So again, like I'll talk about advantages. So the advantages here, it can be somewhat straightforward to implement once you get your system down, right? So everyone, it's easy for us to understand. I have $1 million, it's 4%, or maybe I start at 5%. That's kind of my baseline. And again, 40 or 50 grand, you might be thinking, hey, Tim, that's not a ton, but we're also going to make sure that, we make a really good decision from a Social Security claiming strategy. We're looking at other streams of income, whether that's part-time work or income from an investment, like a business or real estate. All that stuff kind of plays into this. But, we're going to take that 40, 50, 60, 80 grand, whatever it is, from the portfolio, and then in subsequent years, make decisions on how that fluctuates. Probably the biggest reason that people do this is because it does maximize flexibility in asset growth. So here you're really looking at like total portfolio return, right? You get a similar result in the bucket strategy, but you're kind of looking at it in tranches. Whereas this is, I have $1 million. I'm trying to get the most return as I possibly can. So you're not annuitizing assets, so that allows you to keep control. And there's not that irrevocable commitment of like, once I send that check to the insurance company, I don't necessarily get it back outside of the check that I get from them, from an income stream. So there's potential for higher returns. Probably the biggest thing is tax efficiency. So if it's managed well, the location of assets, how you pull from them, how you fill up tax brackets, capital gains harvesting, Roth conversions, all of these things that can extend your portfolio, that is part of this whole strategy. It's you retain full estate value. So, if I cut a check for $500,000 and that to an annuity company, and that check turns off when I die, my kids don't get that money unless I put that rider in that, and I get a reduced check. So this basically, I pass away, that money goes to Shay. She passes away, that money goes to my kids or whoever my beneficiaries are. And it's really designed to kind of tailor to your risk. So advantages, the disadvantages: no guaranteed income outside of Social Security. You still have market and sequence risk, so you're still kind of playing that game. Although the decisions you make can kind of mitigate that a bit. It does require active monitoring. I would say at least once a year to kind of figure out, okay, what are we doing for this year? There's some psychology here. Again, you can be over attentive to the market because again, that's where the next paychecks come in. You still have inflation risk, although I think that's mitigated if you're looking for total return. And there's potential tax complexity if you don't do it right. So this one I think is the most popular, and there's lots of advantages, but there's also lots of disadvantages. And I think the potential pitfalls for inefficiency and lack of optimization with regard to how best to build the paycheck.
Great summary, Tim. And the thing that jumped off the page to me, which applies across the retirement planning and regardless of withdrawal strategy, although more important here, as you mentioned, is the flexibility piece. Flexibility, flexibility, flexibility. And this is in part what makes the planning a little bit difficult is we may in our mind say, hey, I'm going to retire at the age of 65 and we're going to stop working altogether. Who knows, right? What will happen in terms of health, and obviously as we get closer, things become a little bit more known. But will we work part time? Will we not? What's the market doing? What are the goals that we have in retirement? All these things are a good reminder that whether it's in the accumulation stage or in the withdrawal stage, this is not a set it and forget it, right? This isn't the strategic plan that we forget about for 5 years of the organization. We've got to set this plan intentionally. And then we want to be revisiting this because there's going to be internal and external things that are going to be moving and changing over time.
Yeah, and I think what I said last episode about questions to ask your financial planner, I believe that if you are a 7-figure pharmacist, like this requires, I think, professional attention. There's just so many moving pieces with regard to, how do I spend down the 7-figure sum of money in a way that meets my goals and what I'm trying to achieve, not just from a money perspective, but from a life perspective, from a legacy perspective. There's so many different things to kind of be aware of. And, I think, again, having that outside third-party opinion that has your best interest in mind is critical. Now, again, I am biased, Tim. This is what we do. But, I always make the joke, like when I first lived in Ohio, I filed my own taxes and I lived in like a Rita area. And for those that are outside of Ohio, they're like, Tim, what are you talking about? I'm like, there's no freaking way I did that correctly, Tim. There's no way.
Yeah.
There is no way that
Rita will come knocking in like 2030 because they're like 3 years behind sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
But like, this is kind of the same thing, right? Like hire a professional to do these things because there's just so much nuance. And, I often hear like, my colleague's doing this or my uncle's doing this or my brother's doing this. You are a unique snowflake. Your balance sheet and your goals are going to be unique to you and what you're trying to accomplish. So I think it takes a tailored approach to get you to where you want to go.
Yeah.
Right. And that would just be my soapbox for this episode.
Tim, I couldn't agree more. And I'm not shy about saying we're biased because we see the benefit that this has and clients that are intentionally planning over a long period of time. We know it in our own plans. I work with the team at YFP Planning. Like there is real value there in a long-term engagement. And to your point, everyone's situation plan's different. And we often want to apply general advice. And, here we're talking again, withdrawal strategies. It's not a one size fits all. And there's so many conversations, as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, there's so many conversations, yes, financially, but also about goals and emotions and all types of things that need to happen that inform the strategy and why we're going to be doing what we're going to be doing from a strategy standpoint. So, whether you're hearing this and you lean towards the security of the flooring strategy or maybe some of the structure of the bucketing strategy or some of the flexibility of the systemic withdrawal strategy, the key, again, is finding a strategy that aligns with your goals and risk tolerance. And we believe working alongside a third party can be incredibly helpful in doing that. We'd love to have an opportunity to talk with you more about your individual financial plan and your retirement plan. To learn more about our one-on-one fee-only virtual financial planning services and our team of certified financial planners, go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com. You can book a free discovery call. That's a 45 to 60-minute meeting with Tim Baker. We can learn more about your situation. You can learn more about our services, and together we can determine whether or not it's the right fit. And, for some of you, if you're currently working with an advisor and having that feeling of, hey, I'm not sure it's the best fit, we'd love to have an opportunity to talk with you as well, to do a second opinion analysis and see whether or not the current situation is the right fit or perhaps a move does make sense. So again, yourfinancialpharmacist.com. Book a discovery call. Tim, great stuff. Thanks so much for joining today.